Hi, everyone. Welcome to the new online version of Philosophy of Religion. I'm going to be delivering a couple lectures for our classes going forward, 15 to 20 minutes a pop. Um, I don't know where I'll be recording these. I'll be holding up in various portions of my house. I have 4 kids home, so it's going to be a little bit of a challenge to find places to go. Let me fix my glasses. There you go. A little bit. Right now, I'm in one of the bedrooms, so I apologize if this looks a little odd, but I had to find some peace and quiet. Um, these may be disrupted as we go forward. We'll see how that goes. I am not super with technology and recording, but I will do my best. I'm really going to miss our conversations in class. I thought they were fantastic. You all are a great bunch and one of the best classes I've ever had, frankly. So it's really devastating that I don't get to meet with you anymore and talk about this stuff in person. I'm going to do my very best to try and continue the conversation online. Giving you 2 options for that. I'm going to ask you all to answer reading questions every week, and I'm going to post them on a discussion board on Canvas so you can ask questions. I'm also going to, of one another or of me, I am, in addition to answering the questions, of course. And about those questions, I've indicated on the modified syllabus that I'm looking for about a nice, healthy paragraph for each answer. While I have you here, I guess I should also say, well, let me talk about the other in-class or discussion option that I've made, which is that I'm going to have a Zoom session every Tuesday at 1, our normal class meeting, and see, you all are invited to join. I'm not able to require it of you all because we are not able to all meet synchronously for various reasons. And I'm going to leave those open-ended. I'm not really sure how short or how long those sessions will be. It all depends on, who all joins up and what you want to hear, what you want to talk about. One other note. Actually, I'm going to talk about 2 other things while I have you here. Final paper directions, I've put them on Canvas. This is sooner than I normally would have put them on, but I figure I'll have, why not get them out there. You all can start thinking about what those will be. They are largely individually motivated and driven. I'll talk about that more next week. But I wanted to tie them into the discussion of presentations. I felt I had little choice but to get rid of the group presentations for the remainder of the semester, which was quite heartbreaking for me, actually, because I thought there were some really exciting topics coming up, and the class was doing a great job with those. But for those of you who are excited to do that research, or those of you who already have done the research, I invite you to use it still and to simply roll it into your final research topic. So it will not go to no use. You'll notice from the modified syllabus that I adjusted the breakdown of the grades slightly for those of you who will not have a presentation now. Okay, those of you have a presentation, you will get that grade. Okay, I'm going to stop talking about the modified syllabus. If anybody has any questions about that, feel free to email me. Let me get into Eagleton, which I had you all read for today. So I'm also very sad we can't meet because I really love this book and I really was excited to talk with you about it in person. Eagleton is a remarkable writer. That's one of the reasons I chose this book. He's very witty, very eloquent, very smart. He is a literary critic by profession. He is not a theologian or philosopher of religion, although he certainly knows those fields very well. He is too modest when he distances himself from those fields. This book was inspired by, or was based on a series of lectures he gave at Yale called the Terry Lectures. And they are lectures, I don't know how often they are, but they've been going on for about 100 years now, devoted to the topic of religion and science. And you should, if you have the hard copy, you should notice inside the title page a list of other Terry lectures that have been published, some by very eminent people. Paul Tillich, John Dewey, Carl Jung, Paul Ricoeur, Mary Douglas, the list goes on. He delivers these in 2008. Let me get into the book now, into the text. He is taking on Ditchkins, and that's his humorous mashup of Dawkins and Hitchens. Coffee grain, sorry. Okay, so Dawkins you know well. I don't need to talk about Dawkins, but I will talk about Hitchens. Let me say one thing first of all. Ditchkins is a stand-in for the other new atheists as well. That is his target more broadly. Specifically, it's Dawkins and Hitchens because they're the best known, at least when he's writing this, they're the best known, most publicly known of these new atheists. And who were these new atheists? Well, they are a movement that pops up around the mid-90s of various intellectuals and writers and public figures, frankly, who are very eloquent and very outspoken in their animosity towards religion. Dennett is grouped in there with them as well, as is Martin Amis, who is a British author. About Hitchens, he has died about 10 years ago, but he was very well known before he died, almost right up until his death. He died young. He was a very well-known public figure. You would have seen him on television quite a bit. I don't know if he was on Bill Maher's show, probably. He had a column for Esquire magazine. Very, very good writer. He's an interesting guy. And he was very upsetting to a lot of religious people. He is an interesting guy. Eagleton mentions that they were political allies back in the 60s. But Hitchens transforms intellectually until by the early 2000s he is allied with the neocons. And the neocons, or neoconservatives, they were a group of secular, hawkish conservatives in the Republican Party. They largely have abandoned Trump. They're some of the most prominent never-Trumpers, and because they were secular, they rose to prominence around 9/11 because they were very hawkish, in particular, in pushing for war with Islam. They drove the war in Iraq back in 2003. And you could say that, one of the main reasons they were so bullish on war with Islam is because they felt that Islamic fundamentalism was not something that you could reason with or negotiate with. It could only be dealt with by force. So, let's dive into his critique. Eagleton is very critical of these guys, and for a few reasons. For one, they portray Christianity and religion more broadly as offering a rival view of the universe to science. They are wrong. By the way, that's a quote on page 6. They are wrong, he says. Christianity was never meant to be an explanation of things in the first place. The New Testament does not portray God as a creator, a, quote, mega manufacturer or, quote, celestial engineer. That's page 8. That is not how the New Testament portrays God, according to Eagleton. God made the world as a gift, he says. This is what Orthodox Christianity teaches. He created it out of love, not need. He created it freely. Thus, his principal relationship to the world is not through creation, but love. And that is, sorry, I'm going to fix my glasses again. This is driving me nuts. He goes on to say that God is gloriously pointless. That's a quote on page 10. There is no reason for the universe, and we exist purely for the pleasure of it. Jesus exudes this pointlessness. for a variety of reasons. He does not work. He cares little for social concerns or practical demands. And I'm going to read a quote here on page 10, gives you an idea of Eagleton's eloquence. Page 10, right around there, the middle of the page. Jesus, unlike most responsible American citizens, appears to do no work and is accused of being a glutton and a drunkard. He's presented as homeless, propertyless, celibate, peripatetic, socially marginal, disdainful of kinfolk, without a trade, a friend of outcasts and pariahs, averse to material possessions, without fear for his own safety, careless about purity regulations, blah, blah, blah. Now, end of the page, 10. He, that is Jesus, sounds like a cross between a hippie and a guerrilla fighter. He respects the Sabbath not because it means going to church, but because it represents a temporary escape from the burden of labor. The Sabbath is about resting, not religion. One of the best reasons for being a Christian, as for being a socialist, is that you don't like having to work and reject the fearful idolatry of it, so rife in countries like the United States. Truly civilized societies do not hold pre-dawn power breakfasts. That's a great quote there. In a similar vein, Eagleton says that Christian morality is pointless. The morality imparted by Jesus. It is a question of how to live most richly, enjoyably, relishing one's powers and capacities purely for their own sake. This is a quote on page 13. Morality is a question of how to live most richly and enjoyably, relishing one's powers and capacities purely for their own sake, not for any instrumental purposes or ends. He goes on to argue that religious faith and secular liberalism are not at odds, but actually agree quite a bit as well. I'm going to call your attention to another quote, page 18. Very bottom of the page. Where's my camera? Boom. Salvation, rather pathetically, turns out to be not a matter of cult, law, and ritual, of special observances and conformity to moral code, of slaughtering animals for sacrifice, or even being splendidly virtuous. It is a question of feeding the poor, welcoming the immigrants, visiting the sick, and protecting the poor. Oh, let me start again. It is a question of feeding the hungry, welcoming the immigrants, visiting the sick, protecting the poor, orphaned, and widowed from the violence of the rich. Astonishingly, we are saved not by a special apparatus known as religion, but by the quality of our everyday relations with one another. For the Jews of the New Testament, he says, they would have understood that there is no gap between politics and religion, and thus he says at bottom Christianity is materialist. That is to say, it commends us to care for justice, equity, and the material well-being of people. This leads to another major criticism of the new atheists. Freud issues one of the most influential criticisms of religion in The Future of an Illusion, which is a great book, very well written, about 100 years old now. And the new atheists take up for its complaint that religion is an illusion that, quote, mitigates the harshness of reality. This is around page 2021. This is hardly the case, according to Eagleton, if you pay even cursory attention to the message of the Bible. The Bible, especially Jesus, issues ruthless demands. I'm going to call your attention now to page 22, about a third of the way from the bottom. Okay. Which is to say that those who are faithful to God's law of justice and compassion will be done away with by the state. If you don't love, you're dead, and if you do, they'll kill you. Here then is your pie in the sky, your opium of the people, your soft-eyed consolation and pale-cheeked piety. The gospel demands self-divestment, he goes on to say on page 24, through such immense sacrifices as celibacy and martyrdom. What is self-divestment? Well, it is not merely self-denial, it is an emptying of the self. It is what St. Paul called kenosis, the Greek word kenosis, Kenosis, kenosis. That is how Paul interpreted the thrust of Jesus' message and moral teaching. We must give up, he argued, Paul did, we must give up our social identity, those features that distinguish us and then lead to rank, social rank. He urged that we give up our social identity in radical fashion. And regarding Paul, I'm going to read a quote from one of his letters here. He says about baptism, "Baptized into union with him," that is Jesus, "you have all put on Christ like a garment. There is no such thing as Jew and Greek, slave and free man, male or female, for you are all one person in Christ Jesus." So, as Paul understood baptism, you are no longer Jew or Greek, slave or free, male or female. All the distinguishing features about you do not matter. That's it. That is in line with the self-divestment that Eagleton notes. And the key point is that Eagleton wishes to make is that this is not easy. This is not an easy illusion. This is difficult or demanding, and a lot of people cannot do this. They cannot take this on. Christianity is no illusion. It is no opium for the masses if it is honestly understood. Most believers, in fact, don't get this, but Ditchkins certainly doesn't. Eagleton's point here pertains to religion more broadly, by the way, since just about all religions include harsh or demanding and rigorous sacrifice. They insist on radical justice and equality. By the way, Eagleton focuses here on Christianity and Islam, you will see in the next chapter, for two reasons. For one thing, they are the target of Ditchkins, and he's rebutting Ditchkins, so he's going to defend Christianity and Islam. Also, he clearly knows Christian theology quite well, so he's well equipped to rebut it. To rebut them, I should say. Page 27, another nice quote here, bottom of the page, boom. The New Testament is a brutal destroyer of human illusions. If you follow Jesus and don't end up dead, it appears you have some explaining to do. The stark signifier of the human condition is one who spoke up for love and justice and was done to death for his pains. The traumatic truth of human history is a mutilated body. Those who do not see this dreadful image of a tortured innocent as the truth of history are likely to adopt some bright-eyed superstition, such as the dream of untrammeled human progress, for which, as we shall see, Ditchkins is a full-blooded apologist. So Ditchkins is the one who is party to illusion. That is the illusion of progress and of perpetual human and social improvement. And Eagleton points out repeatedly that clearly Ditchkins is not paying attention and not being honest about the course of history. He makes a nice point about sexuality around here, around page 29-30. He observes that the gospel does not really have much of a teaching on sexuality. Jesus is at least not prudish, but he is forgiving. And he cites the example of Jesus' interaction with the Samaritan woman, I believe, at the well. This was appalling to Jesus' peers, at least observant Jews, the Pharisees, for two reasons. He is talking to a Gentile, and secondly, he's talking to a woman who had committed adultery multiple times, it seems. And Jesus does not seem to care about that at all. This leads Eagleton to ask, why do his followers get so worked up over sexuality? That might be a nice research topic for somebody. If you're interested, email me. We'll chat. Eagleton invokes Aquinas at this point. He invokes Aquinas a couple times. Aquinas is the most important theologian in the Catholic Church. St. Thomas Aquinas, he lived in Italy in the 1200s. And Eagleton appears to know his Aquinas quite well. According to Aquinas, sex in itself is not sinful. He is most intent on arguing that sin obstructs our ability to enjoy sex properly. So again, sex itself is not sinful, but sin obstructs our ability to enjoy sex properly. What is sin in this case? For Aquinas, it is pride. It is egotism, selfishness. You must live for others. You must divest yourself. Eagleton also points out something alarming about Jesus' view of the family. Jesus was hostile to it. That's the word he uses. Eagleton does. Which this may be alarming for all the Christian fundamentalists in this country who argue for family values, and they point to Christianity as bolstering family values. Jesus has some very disturbing quotes in the gospel for those who are interested in family values. I'm going to quote something from the Gospel of Luke. I think this is Luke chapter 12, verse 49. If you're interested, email me. I'll send you the link. I have come, this is Jesus speaking, I have come to bring fire on earth, and how I wish it were already kindled. But I have a baptism to undergo, and what constraint I am under until it is completed. Do you think I came to bring peace on earth? No, I tell you, but division. From now on there will be 5 in one family divided against each other, 3 against 2, and 2 against 3. They will be divided, father against son, son against father, mother against daughter, daughter against mother, mother-in-law against daughter-in-law, and daughter-in-law against mother-in-law. He also says in the Gospel of Mark, this is chapter 3, verse 31, he commanded his disciples, leave parents, siblings, spouse, even hate them, that's a quote, and follow me. When his own mother and brothers came to see him, Jesus' reaction was terse. Who are my mother and brothers? Looking at those seated around him, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother. And in Mark chapter 10, he says, those who forsake human security, including their families, will receive 100-fold now in this age, houses and brothers and sisters, mothers and children, and fields with persecutions, and in the age to come, eternal life. Again, those who forsake human security, including their families, will receive 100-fold now in this age, and in the age to come, eternal life. 2 things you should notice there. Jesus mentions he has brothers. That is understood as common fact by archaeologists and many theologians, although Jesus is never portrayed as having brothers. The most prominent brother that we do know of is James, who ends up being one of the leaders of the early church in Jerusalem after Jesus dies. Any case, but the more important thing here is that Jesus is inimical to the family. Why? What is the meaning of these quotes? Well, Eagleton takes it to mean that, quote, this is a quote on page 31, movements for justice cut across traditional blood ties. Movements for justice cut across traditional blood ties. You may not be wholly ensconced in your family. You must look beyond that realm, that safe realm in some cases. And fundamentalist Christians, they ignore this, of course. But Ditchkins doesn't get this either. Ditchkins doesn't appreciate it. He says, for Dawkins in particular, on page 31, he says, this notion of this Jesus' hostility to the family can only suggest the kidnapping habits of religious cults. Quite to the contrary, Eagleton argues, the New Testament is issuing a radical call to justice which is thicker than blood. Justice is thicker than blood. That's the point. Justice is thicker than blood. And the New Testament is issuing a radical call to this view of justice. Eagleton thinks that we postmoderns today who inhabit capitalist societies will have a similarly hard time appreciating such calls to justice because today for us, quote, love has been privatized. What page is that on? Somewhere in the 30s, sorry. It is a private, personal affair, that is, love, and has no place in public.
towards strangers, for example. Capitalism barely tolerates charity. Many capitalists don't, not many, some of the most ardent free market capitalists, I'm thinking of Ayn Rand, she's in a class of her own, really. Not only does she not tolerate, well, she does not tolerate charity. That's the point. So, capitalism, at its best, tolerates charity, but in its purest iteration, according to some, it does not. And that means that for us today, our heritage from capitalism is that we understand love as a private affair, not as a public affair. But the gospel, Eagleton argues, invokes a political love. Ditchkins completely ignores the socio-political message of the gospel, and they ignore or fail to grasp the plight of the human condition for which it was written. They're entirely too sanguine or optimistic about the human condition, and they ignore our existential questions. On page 37, he has a nice quote to this end. This is about a third of the way from the bottom. He says, Christian faith, as I understand it, is not primarily a matter of signing on for the proposition that there exists a supreme being, but the kind of commitment made manifest by a human being at the end of his tether, foundering in darkness, pain, and bewilderment, who nevertheless remains faithful to the promise of a transformative love. The trouble with the Dawkinses of this world, however, is that they do not find themselves in a frightful situation at all. Beyond the fact that there are a lot of semi-deranged people called believers around the place. It is natural then, this isn't top of the next page, it is natural then that they have no use for such embarrassingly old-fashioned ideas as depravity and redemption. Even after Auschwitz, there is nothing in their view to be redeemed from. Capitalism makes us similarly unable to grasp or appreciate the meaning and message of the gospel. That's Eagleton's argument. Capitalism urges individualism. It urges that we retreat from notions of social justice. And actually, capitalism, as I was saying earlier, is inherently suspicious of the latter. Eagleton ends the first chapter saying that religion inserts itself so forcefully into the political realm because of a failure of politics. There's a quote on page 44. Well, he says it reflects a failure of politics. This leads to his reading of Islamic fundamentalism in the next chapter. So I'm going to say a few words about that, and then we can time out for the day. Ditchkins completely ignores the socio-political drives that surging through and responsible for the antipathy to the West that we see in fundamentalist Islam. Ditchkins, Eagleton points out, barely conceals his racism against Islam. In fact, in just about all the new atheists, he argues there is manifest racism, especially against Islam. Eagleton also notes the long, abysmal list of offenses that the West has perpetrated on Muslim nations over the past few decades. And these are offenses that were perpetrated against secular governments. In many cases, the West actively colluded with and enabled fundamentalist regimes to combat economic nationalism of secular regimes. He gives the example of Iran. In the 1950s and 60s, there was a secular government, and that government wanted to have control over the oil fields in the country of Iran. And Britain and America, but I think principally the CIA, overthrew that regime and installed the Shah, which was an emperor, who was hugely repressive, and they were able to install their own corporations in charge of the oil fields in Iran. And that lasted until the 1970s, when people were fed up with the Shah and they were driven by the Ayatollahs. This revolution was. And in 1979, you had the kidnapping crisis in the U.S. embassy in Iran, and the religious regime took over at that point, and it had the credibility of social justice complaints from the people. And so U.S. foreign policy made this state of affairs come about. And Eagleton argues this has been perpetrated repeatedly across the Middle East. And this is something that Ditchkins ignores. Ditchkins is willfully ignorant about the real causes of terrorism. They pretend it's just religion that's at fault. We cannot hope to defeat terrorism if we aren't honest or open-eyed about its drivers and our own culpability in it. Insisting otherwise will bring us more of the same. And that takes us to the end of your reading for today. So I'm going to see you on Zoom. Take care. Oh, and if there were any problems with any of this recording, or if there's anything, any mistakes you see that I made, I'm eager for your insight and your assistance so we can make this better. Okay, take care. Bye. Oh, and also in the future, I see this is about 30 minutes. I'm going to aim for 15 to 20.